I don't even know where to begin. Even now, as I sit in this dimly lit room with only the hum of the refrigerator for company, I can feel it. The weight of its presence, just out of sight, watching. Always watching. You might think I'm crazy, and honestly, I don't blame you. A year ago, I would have laughed at someone telling a story like this. But things have a way of changing when you've seen what I've seen. It started in the most unassuming way, as these things often do. My family and I had just moved into an old house in a quiet little town. A fresh start, we thought. My husband, David, had landed a new job, and the house, a creaky Victorian with peeling paint and a garden overrun with weeds, was a steal. Character, the realtor had called it. It's got charm, history. Looking back, that should have been the first warning sign. Life was normal at first. Busy mornings, rushed dinners, and quiet nights. Our teenage daughter, Emma, was glued to her phone, as usual. My younger son, Ben, spent his afternoons exploring the garden, pretending to be some adventurer digging up buried treasure. It felt like home for a while. The first odd thing happened about 2 weeks in. Ben came running into the kitchen, pale as a sheet, clutching something in his hands. "Mom, look." He thrust it at me, a strange little figurine carved from wood. It was crude, vaguely human-shaped, with hollow eyes that seemed to follow you. "I found it under the big tree out back," he said, looking at the figurine curiously. I told him it was probably just an old toy left behind by the previous owners, though the sight of it sent a chill through me. I'm not going to lie, it unsettled me in a way I couldn't quite explain. Curious, I picked it up to take a closer look. The figurine was small, carved from wood, but disturbingly detailed. She wore a full-length gown from the 18th century, complete with a bonnet tied neatly under her chin. Her hands were interlaced in front of her, but her expression, serious, almost stern, felt unnervingly lifelike. What struck me the most was the condition of the wood. The figure looked charred, like it had been pulled from the embers of a fire long ago. The scorched edges gave her an eerie, almost grotesque appearance, as if she had endured something unspeakable. A shiver raced down my spine. I didn't want it near me any longer. I tossed it into one of the kitchen drawers, slammed it shut, and turned back to preparing dinner, trying to shake off the unease. "Go clean up, Ben," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. That night, as I lay in bed, a heavy sense of unease clung to me. You know that feeling when something in the pit of your stomach tells you something's wrong, even if you can't quite put your finger on it? That's exactly how I felt. I couldn't stop thinking about those hollow, burnt eyes. They seemed to linger in my mind, watching me even though the figurine was locked away. I pulled the duvet up to my chin, scanning the room nervously, half expecting to find it sitting somewhere in the dark. Satisfied that Ben hadn't somehow snuck it into my room, I forced my eyes shut and tried to drift off to sleep. But that feeling, like I was being watched, never left. The small incidents started piling up after that. Lights flickered, doors creaked open on their own, and sometimes, late at night, I'd hear faint whispers. "It's an old house," David would say, shrugging it off, and I tried to believe him. I really did. Then Emma started complaining. I saw someone in my room last night, she said one morning, her voice trembling. Don't be silly, I replied. You probably just had a bad dream. She shook her head, her face pale. No, Mom. I wasn't asleep. I saw her, a woman standing in the corner. I tried to brush it off. What else could I do? But soon, I started seeing things too. Shadows flickered across the hallway, quick and darting, yet vanishing the moment I turned my head. Movements danced in the corners of my eyes, teasing my senses, but when I looked, the space was empty. Worse was the feeling, cold and fleeting, of someone brushing past me when I was completely alone. My breath would catch, and I'd whirl around, expecting to see someone there, but there was nothing. And then there were the whispers. Soft, insistent murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Low enough to be indistinct, but chilling enough to make my skin crawl. They seemed to coil around me, pressing against my ears, until I found myself holding my breath, straining to make them out. I told myself it was nothing. I had to, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. My sister, Claire, was the superstitious one in the family. When she came over for a visit, she noticed immediately. Place has bad energy, she said, running her fingers over the carved banister. Don't start, I warned her. Claire being Claire, she couldn't help herself. She started researching the house, the town, the land it stood on. And one night, she burst in with her findings. You're not going to believe this, she said, spreading out old newspaper clippings across the dining table. It turns out, our lovely new home had a history. In the late 1800s, there was a woman, Dorothea Wickham. She lived alone on the very plot where our house now stands. The townsfolk claimed she was a witch, that she cursed anyone who crossed her. When crops failed or children fell ill, they blamed Dorothea. One day, a mob stormed her house. They dragged her out and, well, you can guess the rest. They killed her? Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Claire nodded, but not before she cursed them. She said she would never leave this place, that anyone who lived here would feel her wrath. David rolled his eyes. Oh, come on. Are we really doing this? I laughed too, nervously, but deep down, I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that Claire was right. Things escalated after that. The whispers grew louder. Sometimes they sounded like my name. Objects moved on their own, keys disappearing, only to turn up in strange places. The figurine Ben found. It started showing up in rooms where we hadn't left it. The worst was the night I woke up and saw her. I don't even know how to describe it. She was standing at the foot of our bed, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and empty. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming, but then she moved, jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. I just lay there, paralyzed, as she leaned closer and screamed, "Get out!" When I finally found my voice, I woke David. But of course, she was gone. The next morning, we decided to leave. We packed up and booked the hotel. But as we loaded the car, Ben tugged on my sleeve. "Mom," he said, holding up his hands. "It won't let us go." His palms were covered in scratches, deep and fresh, spelling out one word, STAY. We stayed, not because we wanted to, but because no matter how hard we tried, something stopped us. The car wouldn't start. The roads flooded. And then, the final blow, David tripped down the stairs, breaking his leg. It was like the house was keeping us prisoner. I don't know how we escaped. Honestly, I don't even remember leaving. It's all a blur. One day, we were there, and the next, we weren't. But even now, miles away, I can feel it. The whispers haven't stopped. The shadows still move. Sometimes, I wake up and see her standing at the foot of my bed. They say you can't outrun a curse. I think they're right. So, if you ever see a house that's too good to be true, with character and charm and a price that seems like a steal, run, run, and don't look back. It's funny how random memories can pop up out of nowhere. I was sitting in the kitchen, watching the snow fall, and the wind chimes gently swaying in the wind, when suddenly a childhood memory came rushing back. It had been so long since that memory surfaced, just over 40 years, to be exact. The village I grew up in was tucked at the base of a mountain in the heart of the Swiss Alps. Back then, kids spent most of their time outdoors. So different from today's tech-obsessed generation. Anyway, my father often shared stories about our ancestors, the first settlers of the village. He'd tell us about the struggles they faced, but most fascinating of all were the strange, unexplainable events they encountered in the 18th century. The villagers were highly superstitious, often attributing anything unexplained to witchcraft, which tragically led to a few women being burned at the stake. These unexplained events included animals discovered with their throats brutally slashed, leaving no trace of the predator. Despite their actions, the strange occurrences persisted, fueling the villagers' paranoia, driving them to continue their relentless hunt for witches. Eerie sightings of a shadowy figure perched unnervingly on rooftops. Some hunters reported seeing it sitting motionless on ledges jutting from the mountainside watching them. Whispers spread like wildfires throughout the village of glowing eyes, watching from the darkness. Of footsteps heard on empty, snow-covered paths that showed no prints. Even a few children mysteriously vanished from their beds in the dead of night, leaving no trace behind. Even though they had been sleeping mere inches from their siblings or parents, it was as if they had simply disappeared into thin air, never to be seen again. As the gold rush era took off, folks poured into the village, looking for supplies, lodging, and their shot at striking it rich. And with them came the stories. Tales of a strange beast roaming the mountains just beyond the river. At first, it was just the occasional traveler spinning a yarn. But as more gold prospectors arrived, the rumors started piling up, fast and furious. Some of the more daring of these visitors, or downright reckless, depending on how you see it, decided to cross the river to investigate these sightings of the elusive beast. The current was treacherous, the water deep and icy, but they figured if they could catch this creature, it might fetch a pretty penny. Thing is, those mountains weren't a place for amateurs. Sub-zero temperatures, unpredictable snowfalls. It wasn't just cold, it was deadly. If you didn't know what you were doing, you had no business being out there. Not everyone who went up the mountain made it back. Some just disappeared. No trace, nothing. Others stumbled back half frozen, their faces pale, fingers blackened from frostbite. Most were disoriented, rambling about getting separated from their group in the blinding snow. But here's the kicker. Every single one of them, those who survived anyway, came back with the same story. They all claimed they were stalked by something. A shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. It didn't make a sound, moved faster than anything they'd ever seen. It always stayed just out of sight. No one ever got a good look at it, but whatever it was, it left them shaken to their core. Personally, I couldn't help but wonder if it was simply waiting them out, letting the cold do the work. Minimal effort required. For years, no one saw or even spoke of the creature. Life in the village moved on, and it began to flourish. More people came to settle, trade, farm, turning it into a thriving community. My great-great-grandfather's farm had been in the family for generations, and I grew up working on it. I helped with the animals, harvested crops, cleaned the barn, pretty much everything that needed doing. We always had farm hands around. My sister and I loved listening to their stories about their travels through the Alpine region, helping other farmers. One story, though, gave me pause. It sounded eerily similar to the tale my ancestors used to talk about. The shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. By then, I was 14 and full of misplaced courage. I wanted my own story to tell, something that would impress my dad. So, I made up my mind to visit the spot of the last reported sighting. A rocky, dangerous area at the base of a waterfall about an hour away. Not many people ventured there, or so I thought. I packed a bag with essentials for the journey. Food, water, and a few snacks. As I got ready, a thought struck me. What if these were its offspring? How many of them could be lurking in those mountains? Determined, I borrowed my dad's camera, convinced my sister to cover for me, and set off on my bike. The excitement, with a healthy dose of fear, buzzed through me as I pedaled toward the waterfall. I was ready to find out if the stories were true. And boy, did I ever. It started as a light drizzle, but it quickly turned into a torrential downpour. I hadn't thought to bring an umbrella, so I ditched my bike and took shelter under a massive oak tree. Hugging my knees to my chest, I stared at the now dark gray sky, feeling the cold seep into my bones. At some point, exhaustion took over. My eyelids became heavy. I fell asleep nestled against the tree trunk. When I woke, my watch showed it was already 7 in the evening, and the night had crept in. I looked around. As the realization dawned, I was completely alone in a remote, desolate area. No houses, no signs of life. The isolation hit me all at once, sending a chill down my spine. I knew my dad was going to tear me a new one. Before I could get up and gather my things, a twig snapped. The sound seemed louder in the silence of the forest. I then noticed how silent it was. There was no cricket chirping. Even the trees were silent. The air was still, as if holding their breath. The sound came from behind the tree I was leaning against. My heart stopped. My body froze. I couldn't move, not even to breathe. A soft wind brushed against my cheek, almost like an invisible touch, before I heard it. The unmistakable sound of something sniffing the air. A wild animal searching for a scent. That was all it took. Without thinking, I bolted toward my bike, jumped on, and pedaled like my life depended on it. I could feel the ground tremble beneath me as something massive gave chase, its breath ragged and hissing, each exhale a reminder that it was gaining on me. I didn't dare look back, but as I rode furiously, the sound of its pursuit grew further and further away. Finally, I risked a glance over my shoulder. There, standing on its hind legs, was a shadowy figure, its glowing red eyes locked on me. I froze, and just as I thought I might escape, another figure detached itself from the tree line, slowly stepping into the path. It dropped to all fours, crouching as if preparing to chase me once more. My heart thudded in my chest as I pushed myself to ride harder, faster, until I finally reached home. There in the yard stood my father, gripping a stick and tapping it against his palm. A silent, ominous warning etched in his glare, his eyes burning with anger. His face was full of anger, but all I could feel was relief that I'd made it back in one piece. I dropped my bike and ran straight into his arms, clinging to him. He was caught off guard, expecting me to beg for forgiveness, not to collapse into his arms, clearly shaken. He must have realized that whatever I'd faced out there had been punishment enough, so he led me inside and let me tell my story in my own time. When I finished, I could see the struggle in his eyes. He was holding back the urge to scold me for my recklessness, but the fear in my voice, the tremble in my hands, made him think twice. It was well past my bedtime, and my mother stayed with me until I finally fell asleep. But that night, I woke up suddenly. The clock on the wall read 2 a.m., and as I stirred, preparing to climb out of bed to use the bathroom, I noticed something. Red eyes, glowing through the window in the dark night. Before I could react, the figure outside slammed its weight against the wooden window frame, making the wall shake, trying to tear it open. In terror, I released a high-pitched and blood-curdling scream that echoed throughout the house, waking everybody up. My parents rushed into my room, and several farmhands came running out of the barn when they heard my screams. As they stood outside the barn, facing the house, they saw it. There, on the roof, a shadowy figure, moving in an unnatural, jerky motion, before it vanished into the night. But I saw its face. It was the Schatten Wolf. Those who had claimed to see the creature before had spoken of its eyes. Its eyes that didn't just shine, but pierced through you, looking straight into your soul. Now I understood. Its eyes burned with hunger, and I could see saliva dripping from its mouth as it bared its teeth, a snarl frozen in time. It all felt like a slow-motion nightmare. That night, my sister and I slept between my parents, trembling, The farmhands took turns watching over the property, keeping an eye out for whatever it was that had come for me. My father believed the Shattered Wolf had picked up my scent and was hunting me, perhaps because I had unknowingly wandered into its territory. Perhaps it had young ones nearby where I had sought shelter under that tree. One thing was certain, it wouldn't stop until it had its prey. The next morning, my family packed up everything we could carry. We left for the city, seeking refuge with my aunt and uncle. We never returned to the farm. My father sold the property, and we began a new life. Far from the mountains that had once felt like home. That was 40 years ago, but sometimes I wonder, does the Shattered Wolf still remember my scent? Would it still be waiting if I returned? You know how people always say, travel changes you? They're not wrong. But sometimes it doesn't change you in the way you expect. Sometimes it leaves a scar. That's what happened to me. And even though it's been years, I remember every second of it, like it happened yesterday. Back then, I was in my early 30s, riding the high of a well-paying job that let me globetrot. I was that guy. Backpack, passport, and a bucket list of exotic destinations. I'd always prided myself on chasing adventure, but nothing prepared me for what I found in a quiet Irish village on the edge of nowhere. It was one of those spontaneous detours. I'd been touring Dublin when a local told me about this tiny village in the countryside.
If you want to travel Ireland,
he said,
you've got to see it's the rolling hills, the cliffs, it's smaggy.
So I rented a car and set off. The drive was beautiful, I'll give him that. Fields of green that stretched forever, dotted with ancient stone fences and grazing sheep. When I reached the village, it was like stepping back in time. Narrow cobblestone streets, cottages with thatched roofs, and a single pub that seemed to double as the town's social hub. That's where I heard the legend. The locals were friendly, in that cautious way small-town folks are when they meet an outsider. We got to talking, and after a few pints, someone brought up the banshee.
You will be careful, won't you?
An older man said, his voice low. Careful of what? I asked, laughing.
The banshee.
He replied, dead serious. Now, I'd heard the term before. Some kind of Irish ghost, right? But I didn't know much about it, and the more they talked, the more it sounded like campfire nonsense. They said she was a spirit who appears when someone's about to die. Her wail, they said, could freeze your blood.
It is not just a story.
I laughed it off, but deep down, something about their tone got to me. It wasn't just drunken storytelling. They believed it. Another man chimed in.
My grandfather swore I heard her once. The next day, his brother was dead.
That night, I stayed at a small bed and breakfast on the outskirts of the village. My room overlooked a stretch of hills that disappeared into the horizon. It was quiet, eerily so. No cars, no city noise, just the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. I woke up sometime after midnight to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't loud, just strange. Like the wind, but sharper, higher pitched. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a fox or something. But it didn't stop. It grew louder, keening, until it sounded like it was right outside my window. I can't explain why, but my entire body went cold. It wasn't just a sound. I got up and went to the window. The hills were bathed in moonlight, the grass rippling in the wind. Nothing unusual, but the sound. It was everywhere and nowhere, as if the air itself was crying. And then I saw her. It was wrong. It cut through me, raw and unrelenting, and with it came this overwhelming sense of dread. She stood on the hill, her silhouette stark against the moon. Her hair was long, wild, whipping around her in the wind. Her dress clung to her thin frame, tattered and pale, like something out of another century. But it was her fate. I'll never forget. It was gaunt, almost skeletal. Where her eyes should have been, there were only hollow, dark pits that seemed to drink in the moonlight. Her mouth hung open, and the sound, I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. It felt like she was staring right at me, even though her eyes were empty. And then, as suddenly as it started, the wailing stopped. That sound poured out of her like a living, writhing thing, filling the night with its raw, unearthly anguish. The silence that followed was deafening. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. For what felt like hours, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, too afraid to look outside again. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. Stress, maybe, or the beer. But when I went downstairs, the atmosphere in the village had changed. People were quiet, their faces grim. What happened? I asked the innkeeper. He hesitated before answering. He said softly,
Old Mrs. Flynn, she passed in her sleep last night.
I felt my stomach drop.
Did you hear anything?
He asked, his eyes narrowing slightly.
The crane?
I shook my head, lying through my teeth. I left the village that afternoon, cutting my trip short. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to. It's been years, and I still hear that wail in my dreams. Sometimes, I wake up in the middle of the night, my chest tight, convinced she's outside my window again. I don't know what I saw, or what it means, but I'll tell you this, the banshee isn't just a story. She's real, and if you ever hear her cry, you'll never forget it. Look, I get it. Guys have egos. No one wants to be the buzzkill, the wet blanket, the one who ruins everyone's fun. That's why I went along with it. But if I'd known what was coming, if I'd had any idea what we'd be walking into, I would have dragged them out of that forest kicking and screaming. It all started when my 4 friends, Jamie, Mark, Rachel, and Sarah, decided to surprise me. They showed up in my hometown, out of nowhere. I'd come back for a funeral, for God's sake. My great aunt had passed, and I was here to be with my family. But there they were, grinning ear to ear.
We can't get away. Uhu.
Like it was spring break or something. The funeral had been quiet, somber, but afterward, in typical small-town fashion, everyone started sharing stories about the old days. That's when they brought her up. Baba Yaga. My mom's cousin mentioned her first.
You kids better not go near the forest.
She said, wagging her finger at Jamie, who'd already started asking about hiking trails.
She watches over those woods. Anyone who trespasses pays the price.
Jamie laughed.
Who's she? Some kind of park ranger.
No,
My cousin said, her voice dropping to a near whisper.
she's a witch. Lives deep in the forest in a house that walks on chicken legs. She'll lure you in, and if you're lucky, she'll let you live.
When I explained the story to my friends later, they thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. Jamie wouldn't stop clucking like a chicken, and Rachel kept asking if the witch had a Wi-Fi password. I told them my family didn't just believe in Baba Yaga, they feared her. For generations, people in this town had avoided those woods like the plague. But the more I protested, the harder they pushed.
Oh, come on, man.
Mark said, slinging an arm over my shoulder.
You're really gonna let some fairy tale stop us? We came all the way out here for you. What is one night in the woods? You don't want us to think you're scared, do you?
Jamie added, grinning. It wasn't just the peer pressure. It was the idea of them going back to the city, laughing about how I was too chicken to camp in my own backyard. So, against my better judgment, I said yes. We packed up a couple of tents, grabbed some snacks, and headed out that afternoon. The walk was uneasy, at least for me. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. I told myself it was just my imagination, but my nerves were on edge. We found a small clearing just before sunset and set up camp. Jamie lit a fire, Rachel passed around drinks, and for a while I almost forgot why I was so uncomfortable. Almost. But as night fell, the forest came alive in a way that made my skin crawl. It started with the sounds. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. At first, I thought it was just animals, but it never stopped. It circled us, moving just out of sight, too big and deliberate to be some harmless deer. Rachel swore she saw someone standing at the edge of the firelight.
It is just the shadows.
Mark said, laughing nervously. But even he was starting to look spooked. And then came the laughter. It was faint at first, distant and hollow, like an echo. But it grew louder, closer. It wasn't normal laughter. It was harsh, jagged, like glass scraping against stone. Jamie stood up, holding his flashlight.
All right, who is out there?
He shouted. The laughter stopped. For a moment, it was dead silent. Then, from the darkness, came a voice.
Guests.
It rasped.
How lovely.
I froze. The voice was low and crackling, like dry leaves crumbling in your hand. The fire dimmed, and a shadow stepped into the light. She was taller than she should have been, her limbs too long and thin, her skin pale as bone. Her face was almost human, but stretched, distorted, with a nose that hooked down like a beak. Her eyes, God, her eyes, were pits of endless black, staring straight through us. Jamie tried to play tough.
Nice costume, lady. Halloween is a few months away.
She smiled, revealing jagged yellow teeth. Mark grabbed Rachel's arm.
We need to go.
He said, his voice shaking. But before anyone could move, the fire went out.
Stay,
She whispered.
please.
The next few minutes were chaos. We grabbed our things and ran, tripping over roots and branches in the pitch dark. The laughter followed us, echoing through the trees, no matter how far we ran. Somehow, we made it back to the road. We didn't stop until we reached my house, slamming the door shut behind us. My mom was waiting, her face pale.
I told you not to go.
She said quietly. We didn't sleep that night. None of us could. But by morning, my friends had convinced themselves it was all a prank. Probably some local trying to scare us, Jamie said, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. We left town that afternoon. I thought that would be the end of it. But when we got back to the city, things got strange. Jamie's car wouldn't start. Rachel's cat ran away. Mark lost his job out of the blue. At first, it seemed like bad luck, but it kept happening. Accidents, arguments, missed opportunities. It was like something had followed us home. I've moved twice since then, changed my number, cut ties with those friends. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that laughter again, faint and hollow, coming from the darkest corners of my apartment. Last week, I woke up to find a single feather on my nightstand. I don't know what it means, but I know this. We should have listened. We should have stayed out of the forest. You know, life has a way of throwing the unexpected at you when you're least ready for it. I didn't know how true that was until that night. The night my girlfriend, Emily, and I had the scariest, most unexplainable experience of our lives. It was late, almost midnight, and we were home, binge watching some cooking show, when Emily suddenly grabbed my arm, her eyes wide.
I think it's time.
She said. Now, let me tell you, this was our first baby, and neither of us had any idea what to expect. But when she said those words, I didn't stop to think. I just jumped into action. Grabbed the hospital bag, threw on some sneakers, and got her into the car. The road was empty, quiet, the way it gets late at night in small towns. Emily was in the passenger seat, breathing deeply, trying to stay calm while I white-knuckled the steering wheel, glancing at her every 5 seconds. How far apart are the contractions? I asked, my voice shaking a little. She winced and held her belly.
I don't know. Just drive.
I pressed the gas a little harder, the car speeding along the dark stretch of road. The hospital was about 25 minutes away, and all I could think was, don't have this baby in the car. Please, not in the car. We were about 10 minutes in when I noticed something. A flicker of movement on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a deer. Happens all the time out here. But as we got closer, it wasn't a deer. I still don't know what it was. It was big, too big to be a dog, but not shaped like any animal I'd ever seen. Its limbs were long and awkward, its body hunched. The headlights hit its eyes, and they gleamed, but not like an animal's. They were wrong, too round, too human. Emily saw it too.
What is that?
She whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My foot eased off the gas as we passed it. It just stood there at the edge of the road, watching us, its head tilted slightly, like it was curious. And then it moved. It wasn't a run, exactly, more like a lurch, its limbs moving in an unnervingly fluid motion, almost like a panther stalking its prey. But it wasn't retreating into the shadows. It was coming straight for us.
Drive!
Emily screamed. I slammed the gas pedal, the car lurching forward, but in the rearview mirror, I could still see it. It was fast, way faster than it should have been. The road twisted, leading into a stretch lined with trees. The shadows swallowed the thing up for a moment, and I thought, maybe it's gone. But then, it was there, right in the middle of the road. I swerved, narrowly missing it, the tires screeching as the car veered onto the shoulder. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. When I looked back, it was gone. Just gone. Emily was crying, clutching her belly. It's okay, I said, trying to convince both of us. It's gone. We're okay. But I didn't believe it. Not really. I kept driving, my eyes darting between the road and the mirrors. Every shadow felt alive, every flicker of movement a threat. The forest loomed on either side, and the car seemed impossibly small against the dark. And then we heard it. A sound, low and guttural, like a growl, but deeper. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the roof. Emily clutched my arm, her nails digging in.
It's on the car.
She whispered, her face pale. I didn't know what to do. Stopping wasn't an option. I hit the gas, the engine roaring as we sped down the road. The sound grew louder, like it was clawing at the roof, trying to get inside. And then it stopped. Just like that, the noise was gone. The car felt lighter, like whatever had been there wasn't anymore. We didn't say a word, both of us too scared to even breathe. We just kept driving until the hospital lights came into view. When we pulled into the emergency bay, I practically dragged Emily inside. The nurses rushed her into a room, and I stood there, shaking, trying to convince myself it was over. Turns out, it was a false alarm. Braxton Hicks contractions. Not real labor. I wanted to be relieved, but all I could think was, we have to get out of here. We didn't go back home that night. I packed Emily into the car, and we drove straight to her mom's place, a couple of towns over. I didn't tell her why. I didn't want to scare her more than she already was. While the doctor examined her, I stepped outside for a moment to check the car. My heart sank the second I saw it. Deep, jagged claw marks scored the roof. The metal twisted like it had been attacked by something monstrous. Embedded in the steel was a broken claw, long, sharp, and nothing like I'd ever seen before. We had no idea how close it had come to ripping the roof clean off. But I'll tell you this, whatever was out there, it wasn't human. It wasn't an animal either. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. We've got a beautiful baby girl now, little Lily. She's perfect. Every time I look at her, I'm reminded how grateful I am for that night, for the fact that we made it out of those woods alive. But I don't drive that road anymore. Not during the day, and definitely not at night. Some things, once you see them, you don't take the chance of seeing again.